Hey guys, my name is Matimeo, and ever since the large patch update in Battlefield 4, as I'm sure all of you are very aware, basically every weapon has seen some small adjustment. And so I've kind of taken it upon myself to discover the hidden gem guns, the guns that we may have never ever used before the patch, but now because they've seen a little bit of an upgrade, they're now to the point where they're flat out just amazing, or they're a lot better on the battlefield. And so while this isn't going to be an extensive list, it's going to take me a lot longer to go through every single gun in the game. I mean, there's like 100 that I have to go through. These are the guns that I've been very impressed by. Some of them you might be very intrigued to know are amazing now, and I think you should give them a look. And so the first one on my list easily has to go to the CBJ-MS. This thing, when Battlefield 4 first launched, was awful. It was easily one of the worst weapons in the game, and I dubbed it the nail gun for that very reason. It hit as hard as a nail gun, it looked like one, and it just was not viable whatsoever. Some people would do it as a challenge, but if you wanted to be competitive, this was a gun that you avoided like the plague. Now though, DICE has given this a significant upgrade. This is probably one of the best medium to, not really long range because it is a PDW, no PDW is going to be amazing at a distance, but this is now probably one of the best medium range weapons in the arsenal of the engineer class. One of the ways that DICE upgraded this weapon is that not only does it have very little recoil, this has one of the most manageable recoils out of all of the PDWs, but it also has an amazing bullet spread. This thing isn't going to start to bloom out like a lot of guns in the game right now. That was one of the biggest nerfs that pretty much every gun under the sun, especially the high rate of fire weapons got, is that their weapons now start to spread a lot faster and they don't recover from that bullet spread as quickly. That's not the case with the CBJ. And so while it still suffers with that lower RPM, it only has a rounds per minute of 700, this has quickly become one of my favorite engineer weapons because not only does it have laser beam-like accuracy, but it also hits really hard. So if you haven't tried out the nail gun, you haven't tried out the CBJ in a long time, I highly recommend that you give this one a try. One gun that I have been blown away by though is the Lsat. This was a light machine gun that I never used before the patch. Before the patch, I had maybe 1 or 2 kills with it. It was completely naked. I had no attachments for it, and the only way that I discovered its awesomeness is when I played on Gunmaster. I finally unlocked it on Gunmaster. That was one of the weapons that we had to use, and then I realized how disgusting this LMG is now. Not only going to have to deal with virtually no recoil, but it also has one of the best bullet spreads out of all of the light machine guns. It still has a drawback of having a very slow rounds per minute. This was one of the main reasons why I never used the Lsat before. It only has a rounds per minute of 650, but as long as you aim for the enemy's head, which is really easy because there's no recoil, you do that, the gun is going to do all of the work for you, and you are going to drop people no problem. And while it does take a moderate amount of skill, you aren't going to be able to dominate up close because of that low RPM. As long as you stay a little bit away from the action, you go for that medium to long range engagements, you are going to do a number on the enemy team. Like, this thing is a lot of fun to use, and it has now become my preferred long range weapon when I play as the support class. The next one on my list is another PDW. You're going to notice a trend here. The PDWs, a lot of them have seen some really cool stat changes, and this one is no exception, and that goes to the JS2. This in the past felt like an inferior P90. They were almost identical, but most people gravitated over to the P90. It had slightly better stats, they had pretty much the same rounds per minute, same magazine size, but the vast majority of the people, if they wanted a hip-fire weapon with a lot of ammunition, they had that huge magazine size, then pretty much everyone used the P90. Now though, the JS2 is an entirely different beast. Instead of having 50 rounds in the magazine like it did before, they've dropped it down to 31, and they've also slightly increased its recoil and its bullet spread. You might be thinking now, well, this sounds like a nerf, and I would agree with you, but the trick to it, and what DICE has done to improve upon it, is that instead of having its damage start to drop off, its maximum damage start to drop at 10 meters, they've pushed that out to 20 meters. This essentially means that your optimal kill range has been doubled, and that's insane. So instead of having your damage drop off like a rock, only 10 meters and out, you're now going to be able to have no problem taking people out that are 20, 25 meters and closer. That is a significant upgrade. And while it will take you some time to get adjusted to the recoil, that's one of the biggest things that you're gonna have to overcome. And I'd actually recommend slapping on a compensator to reel it in a bit, make it not as obscene as it is. Once you do, and you start to play it properly, you are going to dominate in close encounter combat. What's crazy is that if your enemy is within about 10 to 20 meters within that zone, within that gap, if you go toe-to-toe with an assault rifle, you actually have a damage advantage. That was something that wasn't the case before the patch. So play aggressively, get up close and personal, and I can almost guarantee that you're going to be able to shred the enemy and have an absolute blast with the new and completely changed JS2. Another weapon that I never used before, but now has become one of the most reliable PDWs for the engineer, is the MX4. Before this patch, I wouldn't touch the gun with a 10-foot pole, and it came down to its excessive amount of horizontal recoil. Its horizontal recoil, alongside the fact that it didn't have the highest RPM for the PDWs, was the death of the gun. Pretty much you would grit your teeth when you first started to play the game, but as soon as you started to unlock any of the other personal defense weapons, you would use those instead, because it really just was not a very good gun. Now what DICE has done, though, is that they've slashed that horizontal recoil. It doesn't kick nearly as much as it did, and they've also given that same damage drop-off that I was praising the JS2 has. And so essentially what DICE has accomplished here is that while it still doesn't have the fastest RPM, it only has an RPM of 830. That's still amazing, like, don't get me wrong, that's still fantastic, but this is now one of the most reliable and average weapons for the engineer, which makes sense for a starter gun. And so if you first jump into Battlefield, and this is your very first weapon when you jump in as the engineer, you're gonna do well up close because of that reasonably high RPM. You're not gonna dominate like something like the CZ3A1 or the JS2. You're gonna have that nice damage, which allows you to excel at a medium distance, and while you're not going to be able to snipe as well as something like the CBJ or the PP2000, it's gonna have that nice bullet spread. It has a reasonably manageable recoil, and so overall, I am very impressed by what they have done to the MX4. And then the last gun on my list goes to the Ogg Assault Rifle. This used to be one of my go-to weapons back in Battlefield 3, but ever since the launch of Battlefield 4, it really hasn't impressed me, and it seems that it hasn't impressed the community because I hardly ever get killed by this gun. When you have stuff like the M416 and the Ace-23 that have around the same stats, there just wasn't enough incentive to use this thing on the battlefield. And so essentially what they've done to improve this weapon is that they've reduced its recoil across the board, and it's now turned into one of the most versatile assault rifles. It's not going to be a dominant weapon on the battlefield, like, do not get me wrong, but much like the MX4, it's now going to reasonably well up close because of its decent rounds per minute. You're gonna wanna go for headshots, by the way, much like I was saying with the Lsat. Go for those headshots. It has almost no recoil. It's gonna be very easy to go for them. It's going to excel best at a medium distance. That's what this weapon's designed for. And while it's not going to do as well at a distance like something like the SAR-21, you're still gonna have no problem taking people out at long range as well. And so while I would not go on a limb and say that this is now going to be the dominant assault rifle in the battlefield, I highly recommend that you give it a try because this was a gun that I loved back in Battlefield 3, and now that I've seen these changes, I can definitely see myself shifting on over and starting to use this a lot more on the battlefield. But yeah, guys, that's about it for my little list of guns that I recommend ever since this gigantic patch. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you found any hidden gems. Are there some guns that you've tried out and really been surprised by? Let me know down below. But yeah, guys, until tomorrow, have a good one and take it easy.